Hello, we invite you to join and listen to the panels under the common title Cities and Spaces of Urban Life Beyond COVID-19. They are organized by the Future of Places Center from KTH and the Oris House of Architecture and are an integral part of the Days of Oris, October 2021. The COVID crisis acted as a catalyst of awareness towards burning issues we have been slow to recognize and act upon in the past decades, such as the battle of climate change, the battle of sick and divided cities facing constant expansion, but also the creeping, increasingly hybridized environments that have become realized to their full extent during lockdown. Inaction was perhaps not only due to, as Slavoj Žižek put it almost a decade ago, the fact that we don't have a clear understanding of the main issues, but also due to the fact that tackling them would require a massive radical change that acting upon them can hardly be imagined in the full scope needed. However, in an interview with Bruno Latour, which was published soon after lockdown started, he pointed to the lesson that we indeed can quickly and radically change the way that we operate, and we can use this lesson to rethink the desire to go back to business as usual and align our modes of action to fighting climate change. Our capacity to adapt, but also the capacity of nature to regenerate, as we witnessed in the beginning when everything came to a halt, was indeed a reassuring notion that perhaps change is possible. As Latour put it, we should not miss the chance of doing something else. Lockdown also has pointed in the direction of changes in micro, metro, and macro scale. Our places of living have become places of work, and the return to the office is greatly reconsidered now. It will happen, but in a redefined manner, as it has been clearly shown that the space of work is often just a framing of many other things than the work itself, which can often be done from anywhere. But the collaboration and the interaction energies that quite obviously cannot be replaced by the Zoom screen are our reason for going back. Furthermore, interactions stemming from trade or consuming culture have already a tendency towards platformization, but the impact that this has had during the pandemic, when it was the only mode of interaction, has yet to be shown. And finally, the platformization of public space, as was the topic of inquiry of Strelka's quarantinology research project, which also looked into the massive changes pandemics have had on cities in general throughout human history, is another important notion to be discussed. So 4 talks, actually 3 panels and a dialogue, will dive into these issues under the common title Cities and Spaces of Urban Life Beyond COVID-19. And from many different perspectives, they will look at these issues in their various scales of manifestation, exploring how automation and digitalization have changed us, how much our society care about the common good, how the changes of working and living environments have changed, and whether the move towards smart cities will in fact make them smart or perhaps not so much, and whether we really have the capacity to act upon mitigating climate change and the burning issues we're facing. So we welcome you to join us. These panels will be moderated by Maroje Mrduljaš, by Srećko Horvat, Tigran Haas, with a final discussion between Tigran Haas and Saskia Sassen. We invite you to join us.
Okay, welcome everybody to a special edition or a final panel of the Center for the Future of Places, together in cooperation with the Oris House of Architecture and Oris Platform for Architecture and Urbanism, where we're going to discuss in 3 panels the post-COVID-19 cities, discuss urbanism, architecture, and other issues on urban sociology and economics related to the issues of our cities handling the pandemic and the transformations that will occur. My name is Tigran Haas. I will be the host of the panel, or host of this discussion, to be more exact, with two distinguished guests. Professor Edward Glaeser from Harvard University, professor of economics, and then Professor Julian Agyeman of Tufts University, professor of environmental policy and planning. So two distinguished guests, two guests that have talked about and written a lot about cities, about justice, about urban economics, about history, and so on. So I'm very happy that you have joined us, and also I'm emotionally attached to both of you because you have been good friends of mine for a long time, but also you've been part of the Center for the Future of Places that has unfortunately been sort of phased out and closed on the 6th of September. You've been on the academic board and on our strategic group. So a lot has come from you, and I'm very grateful for that work of the last 5 years. I know you're probably saturated and tired of all these discussions about COVID-19 cities. You've been online nonstop, both of you. And I sort of had a prepared script, but in these movies, I just threw it out the window before I came out and announced that I'm not going to run for president next year. So we'll do it. I always say this because we're airing this from the Balkans, Western Balkans, and here we always say that improvisation is the mother of all things. So we'll try to improvise and have a good discussion between you two. I've written something in the beginning of the three panels, because there are two other panels that are going to be dealing with issues of transformation of COVID in cities of Central and Eastern Europe, for example, like city of Ljubljana and city of Zagreb. The second panel will also deal with issues of philosophy and so on. But ours is quite interesting, and the citation I took is from one of the famous neo-Marxist philosophers, Slavoj Žižek, that you both know very well. And he said some years back on an interesting program that, not knowing that COVID-19 will come or that this calamity will hit us, he said, we're faced today with grave threats, not solely based on the fact that we don't have answers to burning problems in society, but even more to the point that we don't possess a clear apprehension of what the main problems are and a clear understanding of their real dimensions. And I come back to this citation, to this thing all the time, and I'm wondering, we can start from you, Ed. Do we have an apprehension of the problems that we're faced with? Do we have any kind of a clear picture what this whole intermezzo, this dark intermezzo of COVID-19 has done, and what will it do for our lives in cities in the coming years?
I think it's very hard to predict. I think that if this disease becomes relatively harmless in the next 1 to 2 years, things will have some degree of predictability. But because there remains uncertainty about what path COVID will continue taking, and because there remains uncertainty about future pandemics, that uncertainty I find to be a heavy fog around the future. Because a world in which pandemic has come permanently to cities, in which contagious disease will kill perhaps in higher numbers than COVID, that's a world that is just very hard to fathom, and a world that is very different from the past 100 years. I think there's also unpredictability, of course, about climate change. So that's another area in which it's very hard to predict. That being said, I still think for many of our cities, the right steps are clear, even if the actual future is murky.
Okay. Would you agree, Julian? Would you share the same reflection Ed did, or what's your opinion on this?
Yeah, pretty much as Ed said, but I do see fantastic opportunities in urban planning, which is obviously the world that I inhabit. And I can see tremendous innovation, tremendous opportunity, and a will to make changes. Now, I want to add to the COVID crisis the other crisis that we face in the United States, which is the long overdue racial reckoning as a result of the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. we can't separate out, I don't think, in many people's minds here in the US, the in a sense, cascading crises. So COVID has cruelly exposed inequalities that we all knew were there. The murder of George Floyd has exposed inequalities that we knew were there. In the most gruesome 9.5 minutes of video that I think I've ever seen. But to add to that, as Ed did, climate change and the disparate impacts. So I think in these cascading crises, though, I do see some opportunity, and I see policy making and urban planning stepping up in very creative and innovative ways, which I'm hoping we're going to be able to go on and discuss.
You mentioned interesting term, cascading crisis, and I'm trying to draw a parallel. Maybe we can get Ed's thoughts on that as an urban historian or economic historian. I did my PhD on post-conflict reconstruction, and a number of my colleagues worked on natural disasters. And during that period, when I went through tons of these documents after each of these disasters, especially wars, you get a lot of documents saying lessons learned. There's a lot of lessons learned, the World Bank, USAID, NORAD, you name it, OECD documents. And at the end, somehow, even in the policy making, we tend not to see this holistic sort of systemic connection between things. Let's say a war stops, the primary thing is we try to get democracy there by elections, by maybe fixing some infrastructural systems, and then other things come one after the other. But is it possible now in this pandemic that things will be forgotten when everything comes back to some kind of normality? And as you said, Julian, even these horrific social cracks that have been there will be kind of forgotten, or have we passed the Rubicon that this is maybe the prime sort of the way that we cannot go back. Things need to change, otherwise we will not see more triumph of the cities, as one of Ed's books is called. Do you think do we see in policy making, future policy making, this cascade of these parallel converging crises that need to be solved, or not?
So I can take a crack at that if you want. So I think that, in fact, I'm quite worried that we will forget the need to invest to protect ourselves from future pandemics, right? We have shown 20 years of ignoring the signs of SARS and MERS and H1N1 and Ebola. And I have seen very little out of the Biden administration, which suggests that they want to spend, hundreds of billions of dollars to make sure that this never happens again. I find it somewhat odd that we've decided that infrastructure is our priority rather than preventing pandemics. I see less risk in us forgetting the fight to battle terrible inequities in our cities and in our world, in part because that battle has been gaining momentum over the past 20 years. That has left our cities far more fractured, and it's created both tremendous opportunity and a sense of urban weakness. It all depends on how things play out. So, as was just said, this was a terribly unequal pandemic. It was a pandemic that killed the poor far more than it killed the rich. The work of Raj Chetty, my colleague who looked at mortality data by income in 2020, finds that basically the mortality of the rich didn't go up at all in 2020 in the US. All of the extra deaths were located in the poor because the rich were able to, move to their country houses and they were able to zoom into work, right? In May of 2020, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were teleworking. Only 5% of Americans who were high school dropouts were teleworking. And so they went into work and they were just much more likely to get the disease. And so Manhattan stayed healthy. The Bronx did not. And that just reminds us of these, of the terrible inequities. And I want to sort of highlight three: the rise of mass incarceration, the rise of brutal policing, which with its particularly awful racial tones, that's certainly one of them, and it's a big one. And it reminds us that urban safety, was won at a terrible price. Now, the right answer can never be to go back to the 1970s. You can never go back to the murders that were so much more common in our cities and that also disproportionately killed African-American young people. But we need to make sure that we have a policing that is both effective and treats every human being with respect and dignity, of whatever race, of whatever income bracket. We also have a problem that our cities have become permanently unaffordable. right? I believe very strongly the right answer to that is to build more housing, right? That in fact, that's the way that we fight unaffordability, is we allow there to be more spaces to be built. And third, our cities have proven to be inadequate at promoting upward mobility for the children of the poor. So cities are always places of terrible inequality, right? It was Plato who wrote that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One is a city of the rich, the other is a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another, right? That urban inequality reflects the fact that cities are relatively pleasant places to be rich, and they're less intolerable places to be poor, because you don't need a whole fleet of cars to get around, because you have better access to the social safety net, because you have jobs in the service sector that give you some possibility of getting out of poverty. And indeed, poor adults who come to cities do experience wage gains, but poor children end up doing worse in cities, right? There's particularly a gap right at the edge of central city school districts in the US, where you end up significantly higher in the adult income distribution if you grew up right outside the city school districts as opposed to inside it, and you are much less likely to be incarcerated as an adult if you grow up right outside the central city school district. That's something we really don't know how to fix easily, and we have to embrace an agenda that learns how to provide upward mobility for every one of our urban children. And so I hope that we will embrace these changes. I hope we will embrace smart policies. But I fear that this understandable progressive anger at the failure of our cities to deliver opportunity for all will lead cities to make mistakes that are somewhat similar to the mistakes that were made in the 1970s, when the combination of extra mobility in those years created by container ships and highways and the rich who no longer felt that the cities cared about them led to this great exodus and led to cities being on the brink of bankruptcy. And so I think this really requires both smarter policies at the local level and a national commitment, right, to helping poor children everywhere, because it really has to come from the national government in order to avoid this exodus.
Right, thank you. Julian, as you said, this is a prime opportunity whenever a crisis comes in. Of course, what was it, Emmanuel Ram, Chief of Staff of Barack Obama, right, said, I think he requoted some old quotes that whenever there's a crisis, there's an opportunity we can grab. But I'm wondering, if there's an opportunity now, where should it be focused? As Ed mentioned these two issues at the end now, three elements. And when we look at urban social geography, the health sector, the impoverished communities, how do we do from planning practice or planning theory even? I must say, if I look at the books on planning theory in the last 50 years, not much has changed, honestly. Has been sort of a real big change. Of course, you have changed things, but you come up from the environmental policy side. So what would you say would be the game changer on the planning part?
Thanks, Tigran. Well, look, I want to make 3 points, and they kind of relate to Ed's points. First of all, I really like the definition of urban planning that Patsy Healy came up with, which is managing our coexistence in shared space. Coexistence, shared space, that's what our cities are. And the problem that we have, but also the opportunity, is that we live in cities of increasing difference, diversity. And whether we're looking at transportation issues, mobility issues, housing issues, how do we coexist in shared spaces? How do urban planners help facilitate spaces of engagement, places where we can meet the other? Because, this inequality is not simply a social justice issue, it's a spatial justice issue. Our cities are divided, as Ed said. Now, along that, I see the city of becoming, the aspirational city, the city that has complete streets, the city that has high walkability, the 15-minute city. But I also see the city of belonging, where people are scraping to belong in the city because of all the reasons that Ed mentioned: gentrification, displacement, xenophobia against migrants. So we've got this tension between what the city can become and who gets to belong in the city. And I want urban planners to be better at balancing these two opposing tensions. I don't want us to stop dreaming of what the city can become, but the city can only become who is allowed to belong in the city. And if we keep elites in the city, then the city will become a place of the elite, and those who don't belong will be pushed further towards the margins, the periphery. The other thing I want to think about as well is, there's a lot of talk in the Congress for New Urbanism, for instance, on human scale cities. And we need human scale cities. We do need to democratize spaces to the human scale. But I want us to put an E on the word human. I want humane scaled cities, humane scaled planning, policies and plans that increase human dignity, that are empathetic. And I just want to say one thing that neither Ed nor I have mentioned at the moment is the potential impact of visionary leadership. And I have to mention here that we're about to have an election in Boston next week, and it looks highly likely that Councillor Michelle Wu will become the first woman and the first woman of color mayor of Boston. She has a visionary set of policies, a Green New Deal for Boston, a food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. She has plans to reform the Boston Planning and Development Agency along more community-based lines. So I think those three key points that I made about urban planning, I think they are enshrined in this visionary young politician's mind, in a sense. And I'm looking forward to seeing how she begins to implement this visionary policy agenda, thereby changing the narrative for the great city of Boston.
That's great. And you brought the 15-minute city, and this is an unavoidable thing. And I know you both have discussed it. I've analyzed a little bit because what we've seen in the COVID-19 discussion, and it started pretty rapidly when the pandemic hit, a lot of our colleagues went online and started either advocating very embedded ideological positions. As you mentioned, Julian, urbanism. Urbanists haven't budged for a minute from their preconceived notions of how the city should look like. Of course, human scale, walkability, and so on. Then you had the proponents of sprawl saying, here we go, cities are going to be extinct, which Ed's also proved in a lot of online discussions. That's not really the truth, and we have seen that's not happening. Cities are not being abandoned. So there's on one side, between us, academics and professionals, a lot of people haven't changed their minds where they belonged. And from what I understood from both of you, and I feel the same way, such crisis is actually force us to change the way we think and maybe move us to different positions that we didn't belong to. 15-minute city, 1-minute city, these are the two big now paradigms almost attacking as aliens, like Martians coming into the cities. In the city of Stockholm, every city is going to be converted to 15-minute city, but for whom? When you think about it, it's almost sort of a new neo-tactical urbanism for young yuppies and people that, they have their super close coffee shops in close proximity of 1 minute until they. But what about the people that live in suburbs in a completely isolated, ethnically enclave? They're not going to have any kind of 15-minute city available. So in terms of, how do we get these just urban social geographies? I mean, Julian, you mentioned this, of course, a progressive mayor, changes will be there, but we'll still be seeing this divided city that Ed mentioned, right? I mean, these two cities living parallel side by side. How do we move academics and professionals from their embedded positions that, there's need maybe to advocate for something else because changes are so major out there? What needs to be done?
So I want to chime in on the 15-minute city for a second and offer a slight critique. So I believe there are aspects of the 15-minute city that I am strongly in favor of. Certainly, I have always liked walkability. I'm a pedestrian. I love pedestrian space myself. And I think, the fact that the pandemic has allowed for more walkability in some areas is great. Secondly, there's another aspect of the 15-minute city, which is making it easier for small businesses to open in every neighborhood, right? Eliminating the barriers that stop urban creativity from creating entrepreneurship that can make the city space itself come alive. And, it is an outrage in the US that we make the entrepreneurship of the rich so much easier than the entrepreneurship of the poor. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm room, you can basically have 1 billion users and have possibly hacked an election before any regulators start paying attention to you. If you want to start your cafe that sells milk products 5 blocks away, you have to get through at least 15 permits to open your doors. And that is really an outrage. And so things that promote sort of walkability and opening up new businesses, I'm all in favor of those. But I am very scared when I hear the word 15-minute city, because to me that sounds like a city of enclaves rather than a city of connection. To me that sounds like more segregation. It sounds like we're going to allow the rich to have their own little neighborhoods and cut themselves off from the rest of the city. And that's the last thing I want. I believe, and I've long believed, that cities should be archipelagos of neighborhoods that give people different choices. But I want those neighborhoods to be profoundly connected. I want those neighborhoods to be places where the kids of the poor regularly interact with and hopefully live close by the children of the rich. And that's one of the things that we've really seen in the new cell phone data, is that while the experience segregation of the poor, meaning that of poor adults, meaning what happens during the day for a poor adult, right? They go into a workplace where they often mix with richer people. They go into a world in which it's fairly integrated. But poorer children wake up in their segregated housing project, they go to their segregated schools, they play on segregated blocks, and they live in a world that in some sense is a 15-minute world, but it can be a pretty isolated 15-minute world. And I think that's one of the reasons why upward mobility for kids in cities is so much worse than upward mobility for adults. And I will just finally say, on the Boston mayor's case, I do not ever take sides on political races, but Michelle Wu was my student as an undergraduate.
There you go. Okay. Julian, your thought on 15-minute city? I know it's been discussed a lot. Would you agree with Ed?
Absolutely. I think Ed characterized it superbly. I don't think I can add any more. But obviously the overlay of this is not just socioeconomic, but it's racial as well. I mean, we've noticed that there is a new phenomenon in cities called greenlining. It's not redlining, it's not racially motivated, but it's socioeconomically motivated. These green neighborhoods, these complete streets neighborhoods with bump outs, with trees, with enhanced walkability, with cycle lanes, with medians, with bioswales, everything that you can think of that could be good in a neighborhood comes with a price premium. And, if we take, and Ed might disagree, but I think that the number one urban sustainability metric is walkability. Now, it can be measured by the walk score on a scale from 0 to 100. If your home is in a neighborhood with 90 plus, your realtor is going to be using walk score to advertise your home. Realtors are already advertising, using sustainability to advertise. So we've commodified sustainability. Who owns the app for walk score? It's Redfin, the real estate giant. So yes, I mean, I just see the 15-minute city as a reinscription of socio-spatial injustices that we've been trying in urban planning to get rid of. We've not done a good job, but it's a problem. So this idea of greenlining then is the coalescence of these green neighborhoods, and one author, a sociologist at Brooklyn College, has called greening whitening. Now, don't get me wrong, I want green cities. I want green and socially just cities. But here in the US, green neighborhoods come at a price premium. So it's a socioeconomic calculus rather than redlining, which was purely a racially based calculus.
Right. Something reminded me when you, Julian, you mentioned, try to connect two things, and I had some exchanges with your colleague, Ed, Robert Putnam, who sort of reinvigorated the social capital the whole thing around social capital maybe 10, 15 years ago, although now it's he's into different things. But I'm thinking of, how do we really go from planning cities to sustaining community? And I'm thinking now, after the pandemic, and Julian has mentioned something which reminded me, a colleague of ours from New Urbanism who's done a lot of work with low-income communities, Daniel Solomon, has written a beautiful book actually for our center called Love versus Hope. And one of his big things inside was longing to belonging, working also with immigrants coming to US and trying to see what kind of culture and heritage they bring, and how is that possible to integrate into the housing estates that are built for them. So the thing is sort of, we talk about the issue of community quite a lot. We talked about these 15-minute cities are sort of revamping the old ideas of, urban neighborhoods from Clarence Perry's, 1929, and God knows how many other models we have after that. But now reintroducing, reinvestigating the new type of social capital based on what Robert Putnam has written and others. How do we see new social capital being created after the pandemic? You both talked a little bit about the landscape of, connecting the low-income communities, the poor with the more affluent, and so on, mixing. We've seen Richard Florida writing about the creative class, and then in the urban crisis, not sort of, going 180 degrees, but sort of coming to terms with crises that brings. So I'm not asking for a new paradigm. That is going to be very difficult to see, but what kind of a city community model can we have? Is it something on the macro scale? Is it something on more of an open city that Richard Sennett talks about, a very sort of incremental being built in sort of kind of a bricolage? Or do we have to have a huge planning sweep change on all levels?
I want Julian to go first on this. I'm really interested in what Julian says about how planning can contribute to this. This is
thanks, Ed. Yeah, let me think about that. As you were talking, Tigran, it reminded me of one of the kind of big Uber narratives in urban planning at the moment, which is placemaking. You know that, I know that. You know that I've been very active in problematizing the term. Placemaking, for whom, by whom. Placemaking as a pejorative phrase, which says, we're going to make a place in your neighborhood because your neighborhood isn't really a place at the moment. Another layer says, who are we to placemake? Are we not place taking from indigenous people who were on these lands before? So I think there's enough problems with the concept of placemaking. But I've also noticed that there's an organization, a very creative organization in Boston called Design Studio for Social Intervention. And they don't talk about placemaking, they talk about public making. So different. Placemaking, in a sense, is quite deterministic. It's the idea that, if we change the environment, the cityscape, things will be different. But DS4SI's idea of public making, I think, is a different one, about making community, about building and rebuilding social capital, about intercultural learning, about this concept of contact theory, the idea that if we can get people together in spaces across difference, they can learn about each other. And if you think of the work of someone like, and I'm blanking on his name, Elijah, I'm forgetting his name, sociologist at Yale, talks about the cosmopolitan canopy. He talks about the idea that for the most part, we move through public spaces trying not to look at each other and to not catch people's eyes. But he said there are places in cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies, where we are at ease with difference. And his classic example is Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia, where groups of ethnically, religiously, racially, gender-based difference, they sit down together, they eat together, they watch a ball game together. The question for me is there a role for us as urban planners, urban designers, in creating these cosmopolitan canopies, these spaces of contact with difference, so that we can learn about each other and each other's cultures, feel at ease, treat each other with dignity, empathize. Now, cosmopolitan canopies aren't going to end racism, but they are going to be places where we start to feel at ease across difference. I see this as being a really big problem at the moment. We are self-sorting politically, socioeconomically, racially, in many ways. And so I'm interested in public making. I'm interested in cosmopolitan canopies. I'm interested in all these ideas that create spaces of engagement in these cities of difference that we inhabit.
Two beautiful terms. Ed, would you agree with the cosmopolitan canopy?
How could you disagree with that? That was not only were the it was just beautifully put, as well as expressing something which is marvelous. That's why I knew that Julian should take the first crack at that one. So I'm going to answer with things that are a bit more mundane and direct, sort of straight at social capital. And I agree very much strongly with it. So I'll keep it with Putnam-esque terms, that we want bridging social capital, right, as well as bonding social capital. So we need to make sure that we're not creating the kind of social capital that, it was awful form of social capital that actually created many of the racial barriers to keep out, strangers, to keep out particularly African Americans. I think of the Hyde Park Improvement Committee of the 1910s and 20s in Chicago, which explicitly formed, it was social capital of its form, explicitly formed to keep Hyde Park white. So we really have to be hopeful that we can get a social capital that is cosmopolitan, that is bridging. Now, how does that get formed? I'm very skeptical of the federal government's ability to help on this in any way. I mean, maybe there's a little bit that can be done with tax policy, but this is not something that the Department of the Interior or even the Department of Housing and Urban Development has particular skills at. Local leaders, mayors, city council members can play a role. They can inspire, they can reach across, but ultimately social capital is formed from the ground up. So it's formed at the individual level, and the goal is to just hope that urbanites of every race, of every persuasion, come together and fight together for the good of their city, right? And I think the way that this is formed is not with starting with grand aspirations, at least in terms of these local groups, but to start with something small. To start with something which is, how can we make our community more inclusive? How can we run an after-school problem? How can we help the food bank to be a little bit better? These small things that just connect people around a pragmatic, simple task and end up, right, through the process of doing that thing collectively, end up creating bonds that tie. And so historically, those roles were sometimes played by churches. As religious groups have become weaker, there's more of a need for secular society to pick up this task and to understand the vital role of enabling people to come together and to work for the common good of the city.
Wonderful. I have something on the housing dilemma. I'll just come in a second, but I just want to take it back to the justice issues. And there's always questions being asked when Susan Feinstein wrote her book about the just city, when Julian wrote his things about the shared cities and just sustainabilities, and going even back to his fantastic work on environmental justice, to an unfortunately very forgotten, brilliant mind of Edward Soja. And his death passed almost under the radar for almost every academic institution everywhere, but we know how much work he has done on the spatial justice issues. So I can ask you, Julian, all these terms we always get from the students' feedback. So how do I convert this into physical form? How do I design and plan cities based on these wonderful principles that all these people have been working on? How do we do it, Julian?
Well, great question, and it's a lifelong project, Tigran. I just want to jump back to a word that Ed mentioned and that I mentioned, food. I think food has the potential. It's no coincidence that Elijah Anderson's Cosmopolitan Canopy premier example is the Reading Terminal Food Market in Philadelphia. Food spaces, our interest in food, spans cultural, racial, gender-based. It spans so many differences in our society. And thinking about food, I want to see much more attention paid to, for instance, community gardens, those spaces in communities that people can come together, again, across food. And I hypothesize about two community gardeners, a Jamaican guy and an Irish guy, and they ask each other what they're growing, and the Jamaican guy says, hey, listen, take this home, this is what you do with this, cook this, let me know what you think. And then next week, they meet again, and the Irish guy says, hey, why don't you come around to my house? I'm going to cook you some traditional food. That possibility in those spaces, I think, is really, really important. And I think it speaks to Ed's absolutely spot on point about ground up and at the very small scale. These changes are being made. We need to scale up, scale out, and scale deep on these changes. And scaling deep means, these changes as potential for values shift. So I really do think food spaces are the most important, but yet they are the most fragile spaces in our cities. Community gardens, urban agriculture, unless you have community land trusts, as we do in Boston, you are going to find these spaces held in precarity. They are waiting for the highest and best use of land. This is why I think we need to change our ideas from, in certain cases, from exchange value to the use value of land. Imagine certain communities where that bridging and bonding social capital can happen, and that yet the community garden is taken away because the landowner has a better and higher use for that land. I would like to see mayors exercise in some way, and I don't know how that happens, but exercise in certain instances this notion or invoke the use value of land, in that this community has so much need for this connecting space that I am going to use my powers to make sure it stays in the community's trust, if you like. So I see in food, and this is why I'm excited about the WU agenda, a food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. Not just about growing food, but about rights for the food workers, most of whom are low income, minority, many of whom are undocumented. So yeah, I really wanted to make that point and solidify this idea that, food, I think, is the great leveler, and we don't really recognize it as such.
And of course, you wrote a wonderful book, but now my memory must be the post-COVID syndrome. I cannot remember the name of the great book you wrote about food justice, Julian. Just please remind me of the title.
Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability.
Yeah.
And MIT Press are begging us for a second edition of that book because it has become, the classic on food justice in a sense. And this, we make these points. Immigrants, when they come to the US, want to garden. You can go in any city and you'll find amazing community gardens where immigrants are using food as the umbilical link between where they're from and where they are now. These gardens are sites of intercultural learning. And if you go to my urbanfoodstories.com website, you'll see the stories of immigrants from Somalia, from Syria, from Bangladesh, doing great things around food and eliciting great interest from the local community. What is it you're growing? How did you cook that? So I think in many ways, what immigrants and people are doing through these community spaces is building the opportunities of engagement. And we need more engagement, especially as we move into the post-COVID realm.
Well, I was still in the cities, and both of you have written about cities from different perspectives and different ways. And the discussions still amongst urbanists is, and even with common people. Recently, I have a neighbor of mine, and she had terrible tragedies throughout the COVID, lost a part of her family and so on. Has been watching these daytime soaps from Germany and Italy, where usually they happen in small-sized cities or townships, where you have your local doctor near at hand, where you have your local butcher, and things like that, sort of the old kind of classical feeling of community. And she asked me, you work with cities, and why can't you build cities like this anymore? Why do we have to live in big cities? So my question is, following on this one, we don't see the flight out of the big cities. Of course, we have different types of conurbations and different sizes and classes of cities and at different scales. I can start from you, Ed. Is there a future after these pandemics in small, maybe medium-sized cities that will have all these things that you just talked about, everything from justice to health systems in place, where people would feel like, okay, we have come into a new equality of spatial paradise and health services that, we're all happy about it? Or can we really achieve these micro sizes where maybe things function in cities? How do we do it in large mega cities that are still going to grow as we speak?
So I think will certainly be medium-sized or smaller cities or towns that will do well out of the pandemic. I think they, by and large, will not be places that are catering to less well-educated or poorer residents, because the way that they're going to do well is by attracting the Zoomers, right? And we know that Zoom was wildly oriented towards the educated, right? It was a wildly unequal event. And so, when I think about the future, think about sort of a tech company filled with highly educated people, all of whom are quite comfortable with this technology. Think about a technology company that has maybe 25 workers who are between the ages of 25 and 40. Is this company really likely to send everyone home to suburban houses and say, just Zoom it in? No, of course not, right? This isn't how work is ever done. But They might decide they don't want to pay San Francisco prices anymore or New York prices. And they might decide they all want to relocate to, I don't know, Boulder, Colorado, because they like the atmosphere there, or Vail because they like the skiing, or Austin, Texas, because they want to pay lower taxes. And so that type of flight from the city is possible. Now, I don't think they're likely to go to places where well-educated people didn't like to live ahead of time. I don't think there's much of a chance that they're ever going to say, oh, you know where I really want to live? I want to live in Cleveland, or I want to live in Buffalo, New York, right? The U.S. is full of medium-sized places, and particularly ones that are attached to colleges or universities are likely to benefit from this. So I think that's likely to happen. But I think the sort of move to lower-end places is not likely to exist. And I think it's also particularly hard in smaller places to find the economic opportunity for less skilled Americans, right? So if you look at a map of American joblessness, it shows this particular ridge of very high joblessness levels for prime-age men in America's eastern heartland. This is a ridge that starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through the mountains of Appalachia, and ends in the cities of the Rust Belt. In these areas, some of these areas, more than 1 in 4 prime-age men have been jobless. And if you think about it, like, I know what a less skilled New Yorker can do in 20 years, right? They can be part of the vast urban service economy, leisure, hospitality, retail, trade, these sectors that employ 1/5 of America's workers, 32 million of them, and disproportionately from lower, less educated workers, right? Cities have those jobs. Small places just don't, right? There is no sort of manufacturing future in these areas. And so I think that's the fundamental problem for imagining that we're going to have mid-sized places or small places that become engines of social justice or engines of upward mobility, because they just don't have the economic demand for workers who don't have fancy degrees and who aren't able to sort of zoom their way into success.
Okay, thank you. Julian, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much like Ed. It's not kind of the research that I generally do, but I was sort of smiling to myself, Ed, as you were talking, because I understand Duluth is the most desirable place for climate refugees, rich climate refugees from the US. People are looking at real estate in Duluth, believe it or not. So I think there's going to be, I mean, as Ed said, I mean, there's a whole load of data about what is happening. But I think, we need to also overlay that with potentially, climate refugees going to cities that they perceive as being less threatened by climate change. So I think, we can't just talk about the COVID effect. We're going to have to talk as well about the climate change effect.
One of the things that
so hold on, let me just add in on Duluth, just to point out how right Julian is. 38% of Duluth's adults have college degrees. So it's not quite as educated as Seattle, but it's pretty high up there. By contrast, for Detroit, that number would be 14%, something like that. So it's education and small towns works well, but it doesn't work well without high levels of education.
Before getting into the issue of one thing that sort of, and I'm a little bit disappointed that a lot of universities, including ours, haven't put much effort on the housing issue. I always feel that, schools of architecture and built environment or schools of planning should have almost a centers for research on housing. And I know Harvard has, and your Tufts, universities like yours, but there's a lot of places where the issue of the housing dilemma is, because at the end, that's our second place. First place is work. The third place is, as Ray Olderburn calls it, the informal places of gatherings, meetings, public, from bakery shops and so on. There's been a lot of discussion during COVID, of course, how our workplaces are going to change. And I know you guys are participating in that. We'll be working, is it going to be a 3+2+2 type of a week? What kind of changes we're going to see in the office environments and all. And it feels a lot of these things are doable. And even in the public realm, Julian talked about placemaking. We talked about the 15-minute city. There's transformations. But when I think about the maybe most rigid part, and that is the housing sector, where we spend most of our lives at the end, aside from our work, how do you see the housing dilemma being dealt with? First of the inequality thing, as you talked at, when you look at Richard's latest book about the urban crisis, my gosh, all these super talented cities attracting talent are also throwing people out because of the extremely high and impossible prices of housing and real estate. So how do we get sort of housing equality, and how do we get affordable housing for all types of professionals that we can have these things put in place and that we can work with the spatial justice issues. What needs to be done on the housing dilemma issue?
So, I am on record for many decades for arguing that there's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. And if you have robust demand for cities like Boston that collides against a fixed supply, you're going to risk producing a boutique town that's affordable only to the wealthy. And sadly, we've embraced something that I think is an unfortunate definition of affordable housing, which is affordable housing means that a very modest number of people get housing units that have been made artificially inexpensive, either through public subsidy or because it's part of a deal where the developer has to provide affordable units instead of as part of the price of permitting. Real affordability means that any person can come and find an apartment and rent it at a reasonable price. And real affordability only comes with sort of mass supply of housing. It only comes with large numbers of housing units. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm against, things that are particularly targeted at people who will be always paying below market rents. We assuredly need housing vouchers. In some cases, our public housing projects have done great things. Other areas have not. But, so we should be open to a whole bevy of housing solutions. But the real answer has to be large-scale production of housing, probably in brownfield sites. And we really need to have a permitting process that prioritizes, mid-sized units that are targeted towards people with middle incomes, rather than having a housing process that's so difficult. The only projects that can get through are ultra high-rise buildings that are targeted towards the super wealthy. That's not what construction is supposed to be. That's not what supply is supposed to deliver. We need to have sort of a human-oriented and humane process, as Julian said, that actually makes sure that we build enough housing for ordinary people. Because every time we say no to a housing project, we're saying no to a family that wants to come and experience opportunity in the city.
Okay, great. Julian?
Yeah, I don't think I've got anything to add there. I think it's, I look at where Ed and I are both at the moment. I'm in Central Square, Cambridge, and I can look just down the road and I can look at that great big tower that they struggle to get in Cambridge, where the city has really worked hard with the developer to get, I think, over 20% affordable units. And again, I think there's a big question as to what this word affordable actually means. But, a broader issue here is, even in a progressive, supposedly progressive city like Cambridge, we are losing the fight against displacement, against gentrification, despite the fact that we have a pretty very hands-on city manager and a pretty active city council. And what we also have, though, is a big division. We have all of these highly skilled workers coming into Kendall Square, the world's biotech hub. All of these workers from around the world coming in, and they don't want to live out in the suburbs. They want to live in Cambridge. We are built out in Cambridge, but the old guard in Cambridge want to keep Cambridge, as it is. But these new young people, they want more towers. Let's build up. We can't build out, so let's build up in Cambridge. And I think that's what these young tech workers want. As for affordability, I'm hearing more and more in the sort of the language, including the political language now. It's not just affordability, it's housing stabilization. And I'm just familiarizing myself, in a sense, with the implications of that. But, I'll leave this with a quote from the great David Harvey, one of the great geographical minds, living geographical minds. He said, "We're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in." And I think that's the problem at the moment. We're building these cities, whether it's London, Vancouver, Boston, and we are building them for investors. I can remember in London in the 1980s, when I first bought my own home, we would sit around the dinner table talking about how much our house had gone up in value. We were young investors at the time, and it's a lure to be drawn into this investment process, which is what we are being drawn into as homeowners in many ways. But I think stabilizing housing markets and making them more affordable, increasing the range of options is essential. But I think I want to tie it back as well to this idea of becoming and belonging. this becoming city, this aspirational city, is here already. It's here in the complete streets neighborhoods. It's here in those gleaming towers. And those who are struggling to belong are the ones that Ed and I have been largely talking about, those who are being displaced, who are being moved out, who are being othered. We've got to do something about that. Otherwise, we are really going to simply reinscribe and more deeply inscribe the socio-spatial inequalities and injustices of the past.
And that's a great, I wanted to say not a wrap up, but the last 7 minutes, I want to get your final thoughts, because I would like to use this belonging and becoming and belonging. And I'm thinking in the terms of a student of ours asked us in one of the panels, can public life survive the coronavirus? Will we have some kind of a semi-social distancing? And what kind of a new urban culture will arise from this? We've discussed this throughout this wonderful last hour, but maybe your last thoughts about this, maybe Ed and Julian, using Julian's two terms of becoming and belonging. Do we need to change ourselves as, elements of urban culture in cities? Do we need a new urban culture? Do we need a new completely understanding of urban social geography? What do we need to teach our students at the end? Do we need to rethink everything we have done so far? Do we need a totally new paradigm? Do we need to put in action all the good stuff we know? We have had crises and pandemics before, all kinds of diseases, but again, one is always suspicious and worried about when you have a terrorist attack, the airport's shut down and they're very careful for a period of time, and after that they just move your hand and you can basically bring whatever you want in. Our sort of human behavior and our human culture tends to forget. Maybe doesn't forget totally, but it's like difficult to sustain the momentum of change. So I'm not really sure if I'm making any sense. I'm trying to fish out something from you now at the end. Are we looking at a new urban culture in front of us, or are we going to get back into the same old mode and wait until we crash and burn at the end?
Change doesn't happen automatically, Tigran. It happens only if we make it change. And so in some sense, the answer to your question is up to us, and it's up to your audience. I think there have been huge lessons from this. And I want to highlight three of them that are all connected in different ways. The first of them is, which I think is the most central one, is that for those of us, and pretty much all of us experience some version of social distancing, right? Hopefully that reminded us of how precious human contact is, of how important it is to see other human beings live in the flesh, to treat every form of human interaction as some kind of a celebration, and to realize that we are just a social species that thrives by being connected to other people. It's what fundamentally makes us human, right? And it's our greatest strength as human beings, is our ability to work with other humans. And so that's one element. And I think it comes both with a requirement that we, with a need that we take joy in other human interactions, and that we treat other human beings with the sense that they are precious to us. Now, related to that is the fact that we have now learned that a pandemic that starts anywhere can spread anywhere. And so that, means that we have a global connection that really is crucial. And to me, at least, this means that the wealthy world needs to do more to invest in the cities of the developing world, not just because it is the right thing to do morally, but because plagues can start in Wuhan or in a sewer in Hyderabad, and they can spread everywhere, right? And for that reason, we really do need to have some sort of a global commitment to fighting pandemic at the roots. And we really have to realize that we are a connected species. And third, I think, it's hard not to think that many of our governments, responded dismally to this, right? And that we actually need a public sector that is more robust, particularly at protecting those who are most vulnerable. But, the U.S. spends many trillions of dollars each year on healthcare, and we ended up with this crap, right? This is a sign of a government that is broken in many ways. Now, unfortunately, fixing government doesn't come with a slogan. It doesn't come with a facile fix. It comes through better management. It comes through sustained attention. It comes by having the humility to learn solutions, right? And to recognize that, we've had these national education reforms steps for the last 20 years. And, both cases of Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind were attempts to fix American schools. And they both were well-meaning. They both had really smart people behind them. And neither one of them really moved the dial. And we need to recognize that we must have the humility to learn before we go in and change. And so this is what I think is really crucial going forward, is we need to have a new urbanism that is committed to upgrading the quality of our public sector. Whether or not that's making sure that we have police who not only keep our cities streets safe, but to treat every person with respect and dignity, or schools that make sure that every child can find the skills that they need to survive in the 21st century, and to realize that we need to regulate the things that we need to regulate, like the things that are deeply related to public health, and also allow more freedom for entrepreneurs and more freedom for those people who would build housing for ordinary people. Secondly, we have to recognize this global commitment. And thirdly, most importantly, we need to recognize just how valuable, how joyful, how wonderful human contact actually is, and how much we should cherish the cities that enable that contact.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Ed. Your final words, Julian?
Yeah, I just want to riff off a word that Ed used there, humility. I think we need, certainly in our professions, in the urban planning profession, in our professions, we need to understand there are multiple knowledges, multiple narratives out there, and our institutional narratives are not the number one. They are one of many different narratives. What do I mean by that? Well, I've been thinking a lot recently about the concept of co-production. Let me give you the simplest example of co-production. I moved to Cambridge 20 years ago. Cambridge was doing city tree planting, and they put a note through your door, will you pledge to water this tree once a week in the summer? We can't do it. This was before they've got these fancy boots now that they can put on the tree and put water in. Anyway, so I did that. I helped co-produce the urban forest in Cambridge. At another level, co-production works like this. If you are discharged from Lehigh Regional Medical Center in Pennsylvania, having had one of a certain set of procedures, you won't be followed up by a doctor or a nurse. You'll be followed up by somebody who had the same procedure. Guess what the recovery rates are compared to doctors and nurses, or if you are visited by a person who has had the same procedure. The personal empathy of the person who's had the same procedure as you guarantees incredibly impressive results compared to doctor or nurse follow-up. So we can co-produce the urban forest, we can co-produce each other's health. It's been found that in classrooms, co-learning, student-oriented learning experiences, co-learning experiences have been very effective, especially with lower income and less confident kids. So I can see this idea of humility could help us in the professions to think, are there ways that we can almost have a new social contract with the public? Think of a park. A park goes through design, management, and then programming. What about co-design, co-management, and co-programming of local public spaces, so that the public has a real stake in the production of urban space? I think that's the future. Humility, empathy, co-production. We need that new social contract now. We are in a broken phase in terms of governance. Let's move forward. Let's move towards a co-production model. And it could be small at first. I mean, we can't just impose co-production, but we could have bold experiments, as we are doing, in terms of co-production. Recently, I visited Chicano Park in San Diego. Now, it's a park under a tangle of freeways, but it's clean. The stanchions that hold up the freeways have Mexican-American murals on them. There are votive candles, there are memorials. Nobody messes the place up. Why? Because the city and the Mexican-American community both have a commitment to this space in Barrio Logan. We can do this. Scale up, scale out, and scale deep. Co-production's got to be the way forward, I think.
I just let the silence take in its power. So beautiful last words by both of you, and I'm really grateful Sometimes now I see after this is maybe the best model, to have two brilliant minds and to just be a co-presenter or just something. Great, beautiful thoughts and ideas also for our students. We didn't talk about education, that we can do in some other opportunity. Also, I've always been happy to be your host in Stockholm. I hope to see you again back there, but also in this beautiful city of Central Europe in Zagreb. Hopefully that we get you to something alive event where we can also interact with people when all of this is close to an end. I would like to thank our co-hosts, the Oris House of Oris, Andrea Russan and Anna Gajski, for wonderful setting up these three panels, and for two really brilliant people and dear friends, Professor Edward Glaeser and Professor Julian Agyeman. And they're both in my favorite city in the world, Boston. So I hope to see you guys in Boston sometime again. And thank you for your valuable time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tigran.
Take care. Thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you, Tigran. It's been wonderful to see you. I hope to see you live soon.
And stay safe. We still have a battle to go through. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, so thank you for tuning in into Cities and Spaces of Urban Life Beyond COVID-19. Extraordinary set of three panels discussing the futures of cities beyond COVID-19. I've had the pleasure to host and moderate one of the panels with two distinguished guests, Professor Julian Agyeman, Professor of Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University in Boston, and Edward Glaeser, Professor of Economics at Harvard University. My name is Tigran Haas, and I am the Director of the Center for the Future of Places in Stockholm. And this has been a co-production with our friends at the Oris House of Architecture, Andrea Russan and Anna Gajski. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you again somewhere, sometimes.